Well, thank you, friends, and good morning. I'm pleased to be able to be here, responding to our friend Shaquille's invitation some weeks ago that I would do a brief workshop on nonviolence, and you are the result of that, and we appreciate your coming for it. Now, I've planned this workshop around the notion that the United States must have, and that includes Orange County and Los Angeles County, California, that we must have in the 21st century nonviolent campaigns of a great variety of kinds if our society is to avoid becoming a national security state and an empire that does feed off of its own people. Now, I recognize that those are very, very foreign words. Okay, who didn't hear any of that? So I'll start. Okay, all right. All right, so I'll start over. I'm doing this workshop based upon the notion that we have to have nonviolent revolution, spiritual moral revolution in the United States. And that's not an empty thesis because, regardless of the way in which you understand yourselves and our country as a whole, it has been the nonviolent revolutions of the 20th century that has brought us in a positive way to where we are today. The women's movement of 1910 to 1920, which created the 19th Amendment, around people like Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, was an extraordinary movement that's not in the history books, ought to have been in the history books, but history gets written usually from president to president and war to war, or invention to invention, doesn't get written in terms of the progress towards becoming a society of free people, and a society of just people, or becoming a society that is really democratic. And then the second great movement was the working families movement of 1935 and 1933 to 1953. That produced Social Security, sisters and brothers, just as one mark. Also declared that working people had fundamental rights that, because they're working in a factory, does not obliterate. Of course, that's been pretty largely obliterated by Republicans and Democrats alike across the last 30 or 40 years. But a massive movement that did help to create change and progress from poverty to, I'm not going to use the term middle class, but from poverty to where people would have sustenance of their lives and of their families and to accomplish some of the purposes they wanted to accomplish. And then the third great movement was 1953 to 1973, which was the first of those three great movements in the 20th century that declared itself in various ways through Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, a nonviolent movement and a nonviolent struggle. The first time in Western civilization, incidentally, that a major campaign upon the part of the people was called nonviolent. And we don't understand that or appreciate it, but that's one of the important values of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott. So that movement produced great change as well. It shifted our country in a very real way, and it tackled critical issues that the United States has tended to cover up. We've tended not to see the problem of dealing with the neighbor in the United States. So we've allowed sexism and racism, bigotry as well, to be predominant forces and pretend all along that they're not there when they have obviously been there. We've also then ignored the fact that racism, sexism, bigotry, greed are violent isms. That is, they have a violent attitude towards people. Greed and what I call more often plantation capitalism has a notion that people who work do not matter. They can be property. and they can be completely dominated by the economic values of the owners or the society. Now that's a violent attitude towards people. It's a form of violence. It's mental, it's attitudinal, but it's extremely destructive. Anyone knows this who's followed the history of slavery in our country or the economic process, the economic evolution or revolution of the working poor in our society. Sexism is a form of structural violence. It says that women are inferior to men and should be dictated to by men, dominated, that men should dominate the issues. That is a violent attitude because it says that a species of the human race is really an inferior species. They're not like the rest of us. And then thirdly, racism itself is violent. It says that people of color, or what the Ku Klux Klan calls mud people, are inferior human species. We're not created by the Creator, but comes from a source that's, they have varied notions about where people of color come from. But in any case, again, that's violence. Above all, this contradicts world religions which almost universally claim that a human life has a sacredness and a creativeness about it, and that insists that the highest law of life is the love of God and the love of the neighbor as yourself, that there are no higher principles than that, religious principles. So I'm giving you a brief workshop on nonviolent conflict struggle as the most powerful force possible. And to start this, we're going to do a short film clip. A major source book, in my judgment, is this book, A Force More Powerful, written around the year 2000 by Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall, both of them extremely interesting men and excellent scholars, but who most of all are men who for 30 or 40 years have advocated that nonviolent civil resistance is the way by which you create better societies. And I urge you, if you do not have this book, that you get this book. It is the first book that I met, and that's right, it's the first book that I met where the claim is simple, that in the bloodiest century that the human race has known, nonviolent conflict and struggle by millions and millions and millions of people all around the world has taken place in every decade of the 20th century. And this has largely gone unnoticed by the academic disciplines of history, political science, and government. So you do not find most of these campaigns in any American or European history books. But in every decade, millions of people, some unconsciously aware of nonviolent tactics, but others boldly claiming nonviolent tactics. And so with this book, there are 6 videos that PBS issued in the year 2000. And I use all 6 of the videos in my continuing community and academic teaching. The video we're going to use quickly is the video, The Nashville Story. And I don't know how many of you may have seen this. The book and the videos have been translated into about 19 languages, have been used all across Africa and Asia by a great variety of people. And this is a basic sort of training module. Now, this film is not a perfect film, I'll tell you that. It was written by Stephen York and Miriam Zimmerman. from the research of Ackerman and Duvall and other researchers. But it is a very good training piece about which one could say many, many things. What I want to do this morning is to simply help you to understand that this was a pivotal campaign that allowed the nonviolent movement dimension, the nonviolent direct action dimension of the civil rights movement to emerge. The civil rights movement is a large, comprehensive struggle with at least 20 different dimensions in it. One of those dimensions, and perhaps the most emphatic dimension, was the nonviolent direct action dimension. And this helped to produce what Congressman John Lewis of Atlanta has called the nonviolent movement of America in the 20th century. And you have to recognize that the movement was much larger than any one person, that the importance of King in it is a consequence of basically almost 20 years of intense struggle, almost 20 years or more. I usually grip this as 1955 to 1975. Montgomery bus boycott was 55 to 57. The 1960 campaign, that can be called the sit-in campaign, of which this was the major example, spread across the country into every state, began to wake up students all across the country, civic groups all across the country about the issues that were being faced by the demonstrations in the South. The Nashville campaign was deliberately put together. I deliberately put it together with what's called the Nashville Christian Leadership Council. That's not in the film. The president is in the film. Of the Nashville Christian Leadership Council is in the film. But this is not mentioned, but it was put together deliberately because a whole group of us across the nation and across the earth were persuaded that through nonviolent struggle, our nation could become a far better nation. I was convinced that if we black people use nonviolent struggle in the country, we could speed up the process of social, political, economic, attitudinal change, that the country would be much better for it, as well as the lot of millions of us. So others agreed with me in this picture, and so we deliberately planned to desegregate downtown Nashville. We set, out of 6 months of examination and meetings, we set a target. The target was the desegregation of the public arena in the city of Nashville that had no laws for segregation as far as I knew, but participated not only in the national ideology of racism, but then also participated in the Tennessee and largely southeastern pattern of racial segregation. So this was a deliberate effort, and we trained people for some 4 months before we acted. We did some action for training purposes, but we only began the movement after 4 and 5 months of intensive preparation on nonviolence and about nonviolence, its history, an interpretation of the Hebrew Christian scriptures that I did in my own study over the years, an awareness of nonviolent tactics in American history. There's a rich history here that, again, it's not called that in the history books, and sometimes the history books don't even do it. But the American Revolutionary period in 1740 was a very revolutionary period in which there was a tax resistance, petitions, letter writing to King George, a great variety of mass meetings that were called town meetings. Even bars in places like Philadelphia and New York became places where liberty, equality, liberty and justice were talked about and as pushed. In fact, President Adams writes in his journals someplace that the independent spirit had already caused the 13 colonies to break with Great Britain before July 4th, 1776 ever arrived. And this was largely done without violence. It was largely done with tactics that could be called nonviolent tactics. Now that's not taught in our American history books, because we don't want any generation to get the notion that they have a certain kind of power, the power of consent, the power of united action, that does not have to be a violent affair, but can be a creatively conflictive affair, and at the same moment creatively positive, enormously positive in creating change. So the 1960 sit-in campaign, and I'm not going to list all of these, but I want to list 1961 was the Freedom Ride. 1962, Albany, Georgia, tried to take what we did in Nashville and reuse it. 1963, of which this is the 50th year, then is the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, which began out of Birmingham. Now, I can do this for another 15 years or so. And each year you have a major campaign in some place like Nashville, but then you have hundreds and thousands of demonstrations across the whole nation, across the state. So that, as an example, in the sit-in campaign, by the end of September or October of that year, over 100 cities in the southern part of the country began the process of desegregation of public buildings and of private enterprises. Now, we in California think that that was only a regional affair, but you have to recognize that in California you had the same kinds of attitudes, the same kind of prejudices and lack of access. So in 1942 or 43, one of the first sit-ins in the country occurred in Los Angeles, California, at the old Bullock Tea Room that was in a major department store on Wilshire Boulevard. And I knew some of the people in the 40s as a student who were in that sit-in that occurred in Los Angeles. So the same process that began in 1960 in Nashville took place in a handful of cities elsewhere. I want to push hard on the fact that a nonviolent movement creates change by a cumulative effect. A single demonstration is not going to do it in most issues and in the perplexities of our society. So this produced an accumulative effect. One of its major effects was what Dr. King called the coalition of conscience, in which millions of people across our nation said it's time to make changes, and told the presidents, and told the Congress, told their representatives that it's time to do the things that need to be done in order to begin to reshape the country. So one of the things that happened, for an example, which is often talked about, was the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. That bill is still in force, though it has no enforcement agencies. That bill, for the first time, said, among other things, that private and public sectors of the economy cannot discriminate against any person based on gender. This is 1964 now. Based on gender, race, religion, or national origins. on birthplace. Now, most Americans don't even know that all sorts of governments and private agencies in the United States discriminated against all sorts of people. And we still do it because there's no enforcement mechanism on that bill that is supposed to be still the law of the land. But no one teaches about it. No government, no president teaches. We are supposed to have access for all people in our society for employment. I hope you will hear that very clearly for me. So there was an cumulative effect that affected the entire nation. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 also said that having signs in your store, in your restaurant, in your skating rink, that says that indicates no Jap allowed here, no WAP, no dirty Irish, no Mex, no wetback, those kinds of signs are unconstitutional, whether in a private or public agency of the United States. That's the Civil Rights Bill of 64. Again, California was affected by this. We think it was only a Southern thing. Racism is a national affair. Plantation capitalism was a national economic order, which we still haven't dissolved in favor of a better kind of economy. So, but it was an accumulative effect. California had in front of Glendale, California, signs which said around the borders of Glendale, no Negro should allow the sun to set on him in Glendale. San Clemente had signs on the borders of the community that said, no Negro, no Jew. I want us to understand that part of our present plight is because we have historical forces that our nation has often cultivated that we have never dissolved. And consequently, a lot of the confusion in our country is because we've claimed to have these high ideals about democracy, extraordinary experiment in 1776,